In 1981, deep within the pontifical archives beneath the Vatican Apostolic Palace, a misfiled envelope was discovered by a junior archivist during the digitization of diplomatic records from the 1960s. The envelope bore no formal seal, only a handwritten note across the fold, to be read in confidence, concerning St. Abigail's Dunbridge CT. Inside was a single sheet of parchment paper, brittle and yellowing. The handwriting was small, angular, and precise, as if written by someone accustomed to silence and structure. It was signed by Sister Marianne Eltridge. Dated June 14, 1963, the letter was a petition, not for funds or structural repairs, as most correspondence of that era tended to be, but for something far more severe. I implore you, in the name of all that is sacred, to authorize the immediate and irreversible closure of the orphanage under our care. The grounds of St. Abigail's are saturated with a rot not of this earth. There have been burials, improper, unblessed, and unjustified. We are no longer stewards, we are accomplices. The letter had never been opened. It had been filed by hand into the wrong cabinet, grouped by some clerical error among agricultural grants for defunct monasteries. For 18 years, the petition had gone unread, sealed in silence, and hidden beneath centuries of paper and dust. That single sheet of paper would be the first tangible thread in the unravelling of what would come to be known, quietly and only in the most guarded corners of internal church investigation, as the Dunbridge sin. The town of Dunbridge, Connecticut, lies about 30 minutes east of Hartford. In 1963, it was smaller than it is now. A scatter of clapboard houses, one post office, and a general store run by a man who had served in the First World War and never spoke about it. The town was quiet, unassuming, and in many ways, the perfect place for something to be hidden. Set back from County Road 42, flanked by dead pine and overgrown hedgerows, stood the iron gates of St. Abigail's Home for Children. They were cast in black, rusted at the hinges, and flanked by stone pillars that bore no name. You could drive past them a dozen times and assume the property was a former estate, long abandoned. But inside, behind the facade of ivy-covered dormitories and arched chapel windows, a machine operated with exacting, near-monastic discipline. St. Abigail's had been founded in 1919 as a refuge for war orphans, but by 1947 it was a destination for the unwanted. Children from unwed mothers, the mentally infirm, the disfigured, and the forgotten. The church called it a haven. Locals had other names for it: the White Prison, the Chapel of the Unnamed, and most hauntingly, the Orchard of Silence. That orchard, they said, was never on any map. In public records, the home was funded through a mixture of diocesan subsidy and private donation. Annual ledgers listed inventories of linens, sacramental wine, and vaccine supplies. But there was little detail about the children themselves. No graduation rosters, no transfer logs to foster homes, only lists of incoming names. Very few had documented exits. The children at St. Abigail's wore identical uniforms, charcoal grey smocks with collar pins of tarnished brass. Their heads were shaved quarterly. They ate in silence, prayed in silence, and when spoken to by visitors, responded in rehearsed phrases. I am grateful for shelter. I am grateful for instruction. I am grateful for God. Photographs from the time, rare as they are, show a peculiar uniformity. Children with eyes fixed forward, unsmiling, not afraid, just absent, like dolls that had learned the routine. In one photo from 1958, a group of girls is seen standing in a semicircle around a small shrouded shape. The caption claims it was a lamb dead of exposure, but there is no lamb visible in the frame, only the shape, the shroud, and a trail of bare footprints leading back toward the orchard. No death certificate was filed that week for livestock or human. The origin of Sister Marianne Eltridge's petition can be traced through her own appointment file, dated 1955. She had been reassigned to St. Abigail's from a Carmelite convent in Providence, Rhode Island, where she had served as sacristan. She was described as obedient, competent, and exceptionally orderly in matters of cleanliness and record-keeping. Her arrival at St. Abigail's was not optional. Letters from her previous superior indicate she had raised concerns about the discipline of penitent labourers in the convent laundry, and was perhaps too invested in matters beyond her station. Her transfer was framed as both a punishment and a test. It was not uncommon at the time for nuns who questioned authority to be repositioned into less visible posts, homes for the disabled, infirmaries for cloistered clergy, and orphanages far from diocesan oversight. Her first 3 years at St. Abigail's passed without incident. She maintained the chapel, oversaw sacramental inventories, and served in the fever ward during the winter outbreaks. But her journals, unearthed decades later in a private estate sale, began to shift in tone in early 1959. She wrote of the orchard, of the bells that rang after Compline, of children she'd nursed who, she was told, had been adopted, only to find their belongings burned in the furnace the next morning. And she wrote of one particular child, a girl named Therese, no last name, 6 years old, malnourished, violent night terrors, a limp that worsened by the week. One day, Sister Marianne noted, the girl had vanished from the infirmary. She had not been discharged. No medical transport was recorded. When she asked where the child had gone, she was told simply, returned. Returned to whom? There was no file. The terminology used within St. Abigail's was peculiar even by ecclesiastical standards. Words like exit, transfer, or death were rarely used. Instead, files would be marked with a red cross and the phrase iterum Deo, or again to God. Children marked with that phrase were never seen again, not by staff, not by visiting clergy, not by anyone. Sister Marianne's journal entries became increasingly distressed. She began collecting scraps, blanket corners, hair ribbons, broken rosary beads, and labelling them by child's name. She hid them behind the false panel of the sacristy drawer. It was as if she were trying to preserve some evidence that the children had existed at all. On March 3, 1963, her tone changed. She stopped referring to specific names. Her entries became lists, timestamps, temperatures, the number of coffins that had been delivered that month, 4. The groundskeeper's logs from that same month, later subpoenaed in a civil case that was quietly dropped, contained a simple entry. Trench ready, Orchard East, same depth. No graves were ever officially registered. The petition was dated just 3 months later. In it, Sister Marianne outlined her fears, not only of impropriety, but of spiritual complicity. She used the phrase sacramental inversion. A theologian later consulted during the Vatican's closed internal review suggested that the term referred to the use of ritual and religious language to justify acts entirely opposed to the Church's teachings. In effect, murder under the guise of grace. And not a single bishop responded. The envelope remained sealed, misfiled, unacknowledged, forgotten, until it wasn't. What makes this story particularly chilling is that it wasn't driven by madness or the occult. It was not the product of a secret order or demonic pact. It was carried out by educated, consecrated women acting within the hierarchy of a system that demanded obedience above conscience. The Church's response when the letter was rediscovered was to issue a statement affirming that the historical St. Abigail's Home for Children was a facility of mercy and sacrifice, guided by the Holy Spirit and staffed by women of unquestionable devotion. No apology, no inquiry, no mention of the orchard, and yet whispers persist. In Dunbridge, older residents still speak of the night trains, unmarked cars that arrived behind the property at odd hours, children arriving wrapped in blankets, or worse, leaving in crates. Others remember a peculiar tradition among the local altar boys. Each year, before winter, they were instructed to bless the roots. No one knew what that meant. The orchard was fenced off, but once a year they were led in, each carrying a candle. They were told not to speak, only to walk in silence, leave the candles at the centre tree, and return without question. No explanation was ever given. In 1982, a year after the petition's discovery, the grounds of St Abigail's were sold to a private trust and declared unsuitable for redevelopment due to unresolved soil toxicity. The orchard was levelled, the dormitories burned in a fire of unclear origin. All that remains is the chapel, boarded, weather-beaten, and still locked. Inside, beneath the pulpit, a crawl space was discovered in 1994 by a team of paranormal investigators trespassing on the property. Though their footage is sensationalized and largely discredited, what they found cannot be entirely dismissed. 4 child-sized cots, a wooden chair bolted to the floor, and a rusted basin marked with the words Iterum Deo. With the rediscovery of Sister Marianne's petition, the question remains, not what happened, but how many allowed it to happen. Not in the shadows, not in secret, but in plain sight, under the cloth of holy orders, behind the stained glass of God's house, and beneath the orchard that bore no fruit. The Church processed no disciplinary actions. The state opened no inquiry, and the names, what little of them remain, were not carved into stone, but burned into forgotten ledgers and buried in unmarked ground. With the letter now archived, the final line remains the only true epitaph for those who died without a name. We were never meant to bury them, and yet we did, one by one, as instructed. In the winter of 1959, Connecticut's Department of Health issued a routine memo to all religious institutions under public care contracts. The directive was simple: submit quarterly documentation for infectious disease protocols, particularly regarding influenza and child mortality during the colder months. For most facilities, the response was uneventful. Checklists, inventory ledgers, death certificates, and vaccination logs filed in carbon triplicate. But St Abigail's Home for Children sent something different. A single-page statement typed in fading ink, signed by Sister Maureen Callahan, the head matron. It cited an unusually virulent influenza strain and attributed 17 deaths over a 3-month span to pre-existing immune fragility among the orphaned and unadoptable. No names were listed, no physician's sign-off appeared, and yet the form was stamped, logged and filed. There was no follow-up. St Abigail's was not a hospital. It was not formally licensed as a medical facility. It held no emergency capacity and was rarely inspected. Yet for decades it operated what its staff referred to as the fever ward, a repurposed rectory wing with iron-barred windows, poor insulation, and no plumbing beyond a cracked porcelain sink mounted to the eastern wall. The mattresses were filled with straw. The walls, never painted, were stained with streaks of iodine and mildew. The smell was a mix of lye, damp linen, and something else, metallic, sour, and unmistakably organic. 2 surviving nurses from that period, interviewed separately in 1999, described the fever ward as punishment under the guise of healing. One, Margaret Wells, was 19 when she arrived. Her assignment was part of a temporary nursing rotation through the Sisters of Compassion. What she saw, she said, never left her. The children were already sick when they were placed there, coughing, shivering, some too weak to sit up. But there were no antibiotics, no thermometers, no records of vitals. Instead, they were given broth made from salt water and boiled bone, and sometimes only water mixed with crushed hosts from unsanctified communion wafers. If the fever did not break after 3 days, the child was taken to the far corner cot, positioned beneath the broken transom, and covered with a wool blanket, regardless of the temperature. That cot, Margaret recalled, was never reused. Once a child died, the cot was scrubbed but not reassigned. There were 6 such cots, and by the end of that winter, all 6 were left empty. The procedures were framed as austerity. Sister Maureen called it faith-led medicine. She believed illness was a purification, and those who could not endure it were being called back to God. She did not allow morphine. She did not believe in penicillin. Instead, the nurses were instructed to administer what she termed abstinence rites. These involved withholding food for up to 48 hours, enforcing complete silence, and taping rosary beads to the child's chest with wax paper. When asked why this was done, Sister Maureen reportedly answered, "So their last breath leaves clean." No external physician was permitted on the property that winter. The only death documentation came from handwritten notes left in a locked ledger, kept inside a drawer beneath the altar. These notes contained no medical terminology, only biblical verses and occasional phrases like "unclaimed by kin" or "confession refused." The children who survived the fever ward bore scars that were not always physical. One former resident, Paul Fenwick, spoke under pseudonym in a 1985 affidavit. He had entered St. Abigail's at age 7 after his mother died of tuberculosis. When he contracted pneumonia the following year, he was confined to the fever ward for 12 days. He described being forced to kneel beside the bed during the worst hours of his illness, reciting Psalm 51 aloud while vomiting into a pail lined with newspaper. He remembered being slapped when he misquoted the verse. He remembered the screams of a girl named Anna in the next cot, who was gagged with a strip of cloth to keep the ward peaceful. He did not remember her leaving. The cot was empty the next morning. No one said her name again. The local mortuary in Dunbridge recorded an uptick in underage burials that same winter. 17 certificates were issued between December and February. All bore the mark of the St. Agnes Mortuary Service, an affiliated Catholic burial provider known for low-cost unmarked interments. According to their burial log, 11 of the bodies arrived already in sealed boxes. The drivers provided no identification. Payment was wired in bulk from a diocesan account, signed by an anonymous clerk. The mortician Thomas Ballard, now deceased, kept private notes on each case. These were later recovered from his estate by a local historian, cataloguing burial practices in rural parishes. In the margin of one case, next to a girl estimated at age 8, Ballard had written, "Body light, ribs exposed, socket sunken, approx. 4-1, fingers frostbitten. Death appears untreated." None of the families were notified because none were listed. The children were wards of the diocese. As such, no next of kin was legally required to sign off. This legal loophole, quietly negotiated between the church and the state in the late 1940s, would allow more than 100 unreported child deaths over a 30-year period across 4 such facilities in New England. But nowhere were the numbers higher or the records thinner than at St. Abigail's. When asked why no investigation was triggered by the sharp winter spike in child deaths, the State Board deferred responsibility to the Church. According to archived correspondence, the office director at the time, Dr. Henry Kroll, had received personal letters from the Archdiocese of Hartford affirming that all procedures were sacramentally appropriate and that concerns of medical negligence should be deferred to the Ecclesiastical Review Board. Dr. Kroll, himself Catholic, marked the file closed. Internal church documents show that no review was ever conducted. Inside the fever ward, the children developed their own way of signalling danger. Former nurse Margaret Wells remembered them using fingernails to scratch tiny crosses into the plaster beside their beds. Some were no larger than a fingernail. Others were carved deep, over and over, until the wall gave way to raw wood. After each child's removal, a nun would scrape the plaster clean and repaint it in a fresh layer of white lime. But the children always scratched it back. Wells said the marks were not signs of faith. They were warnings. As part of her exit interview in spring 1960, Margaret was asked to sign a confidentiality agreement. She was told the deaths were unfortunate but spiritually managed. She was told that speaking to outsiders would reopen wounds among the faithful. And she was told one final thing by Sister Maureen: "God knows which children are ready. That is not for us to doubt." Margaret signed. But years later, after seeing newspaper clippings about the rediscovered petition from Sister Marianne Eltridge, she began corresponding with other former staff members. What emerged was a pattern: seasonal illness, blanket treatments, silent deaths, and a culture of obedience that blurred the line between discipline and neglect. It wasn't chaos, it was structure. What makes this chapter of the story so unsettling is that it exposes a form of horror that does not come from cruelty, but from a doctrine of passivity, a belief system so embedded in obedience that even death becomes a procedural formality. There were no screams in the hallways, no locked basements, or midnight rituals. There was only silence, paperwork, and procedural acceptance. The children who died in the fever ward were not murdered. They were ignored, forgotten, treated as a burden with no future worth saving, and it was all signed off by people who believed they were doing the will of God. The fever ward remained operational until 1966. That year, it was quietly shuttered, following a brief but unexplained renovation of the rectory wing. No formal notice was given. The beds were removed. The records, what few existed, were boxed and sent to the Archdiocese. Today, the room is used for storage: broken pews, defunct radiators, rusted prayer benches. But on the far wall, just behind an unused crucifix, faint scratches can still be seen beneath the chipped paint. Not letters, not drawings, just rows of small deliberate marks. A child's pattern, scraped with purpose, not out of fear, but to be remembered. In the fall of 1996, St. Abigail's Home for Children, abandoned for nearly 3 decades, was finally slated for deconsecration. The chapel had stood untouched since 1969, locked behind iron-strapped oak doors, its windows boarded, its altar dust-covered and bowed from moisture. The work order was issued under diocesan instruction. A demolition crew was hired to remove remaining ecclesiastical structures before the land could be sold to a private buyer. No historical society was consulted, no clergy attended. It was meant to be a simple job, but during the 3rd morning of demolition, while jackhammers were breaking through the raised stonework beneath the altar platform, one of the workers struck metal, not piping, but a solid box embedded in the foundation, sealed at all sides with melted wax and iron nails. What they found would never be officially documented in the diocesan archive. The object was a rusted lockbox, no larger than a suitcase and heavy with age. When opened, inside was a single item, a leather-bound ledger wrapped in oilcloth and tied with red twine. The leather had darkened over time, edges curled inward like dried leaves, but the writing inside was still legible. Each page bore only a name. First names, nothing more. In total, no surnames, no dates of birth, no adoption stamps, no departure records. Next to each name, a single red mark, sometimes an X, other times a symbol resembling a cross drawn with a broken hand, uneven, slanted, rushed. Some of the final pages were smudged, water damaged, but most remained intact. What the crew had found was not a register of children saved. It was a record of children erased. The discovery caused a brief ripple within the local preservation community. A volunteer archivist from the Dunbridge Historical Committee, Amy Cernin, was allowed to view the ledger before it was removed from the site. She took 2 rolls of photographs, black and white, medium format, with time-stamped contact sheets. Within days, the original ledger had been confiscated by church officials and sent without further comment to an undisclosed location. When local newspapers inquired, the Archdiocese of Hertford issued a single sentence: "The document in question has been taken under review by the Office of Ecclesiastical Records and requires no public disclosure." They have not spoken of it since. Handwriting analysis later confirmed what many already suspected. The script belonged to Sister Marianne Eltridge, the same woman who, in 1963, had authored the desperate petition to shut down St. Abigail's. The dates of the entries, though not listed explicitly, were determined by ink aging tests conducted on the edges of the exposed pages. most entries clustered between 1947 and 1965. All 107 names appeared to have been written in the same hand, with the same pen. No annotations, no notes, just name after name, red-marked and final. Scholars who reviewed the photographs noticed a curious detail. The order of the names loosely followed the liturgical calendar. Names like Bernadette, Francis, Gabriel, and Stephen appeared around their respective feast days. It suggested something darker than a simple register. It suggested ritual. Local testimony from that era, long dismissed as rumour, suddenly held new weight. Several residents of Dunbridge, now elderly, recalled strange processions through the orchard at dusk. One man, a retired carpenter named Eli Gorman, spoke of small wooden boxes rolled out on garden carts after evening bells. He said the sisters would chant softly as they passed through the hedgerow. He was 10 years old then. He watched from his attic window. He never saw the carts return. And then there was the grave digger. William Herrick was 91 when he gave his statement in 1997. He'd worked for the town's Grounds Maintenance Bureau between 1948 and 1962. For most of that time, he was paid standard municipal wages, except on nights when he worked behind St. Abigail's. He described being summoned, always after sunset, to dig shallow trenches in the field behind the chapel's east wall, what the sisters called the orchard. He was told the work was for plumbing or to bury livestock. He was never shown what went into the earth, but he remembered the smell. He remembered the weight of the air, and he remembered being paid double in unmarked envelopes. His final job was in October of 1961. He dug a trench 22 feet long, 3 feet wide, and exactly 4 feet deep. He returned the next morning, and it was already filled. No inspection was ever conducted on the property grounds. Not then, not now. The altar floor beneath which the ledger had been found was never officially examined after the initial discovery. The demolition contract was terminated. The buyer withdrew interest. The chapel was declared historically unstable and sealed once more under diocesan protection. Attempts to gain access since have been denied. The photographs remain the only public evidence that the ledger ever existed. What makes the ledger uniquely horrifying is its silence. There are no accusations within it, no pleas, no explanations. It does not cry for justice. It does not name the guilty. It is a document of finality. One by one, the names pass across the page. Agnes, Clara, Martin, Paul, each followed by that red mark. Uniform, undeniable. In its own way, it is more chilling than any confession, because it documents not just death, it documents erasure. The style and materials of the ledger match those issued to clergy administrators in the 1940s for property inventories. Blank ledgers were typically used to log donations, sacrament schedules, or dormitory assignments. But this one had never been filed through formal channels. It had been hidden, sealed in wax, buried beneath consecrated ground. And the red symbols? Theologians reviewing the images debated their meaning. Some saw them as shorthand for death. Others noted that, in certain convents, similar markings were used to denote excommunication or refusal of sacrament, but none could explain why they appeared beside the names of children. Children who, according to church records, had never existed. In 2001, a graduate student at St. John's Seminary, working independently, cross-referenced the 107 names from the photograph archive with baptismal registries from the northeastern Catholic dioceses. Only 3 matched. All 3 had been baptized at St. Abigail's between 1947 and 1950. None had follow-up records. No confirmations, no first communions, no reassignments to foster families. Each name vanished after a single entry. It was as if they had been born, baptized, and then buried. What made this discovery particularly damning was its timing. At the time of the ledger's uncovering, the church was already under scrutiny for its concealment of abuse across the US. Investigative journalists had begun pulling diocesan property records. Grand juries were being impaneled in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, And yet St. Abigail's was never mentioned in any formal report. No lawsuits were filed, no victims came forward, because there were none left to speak. The children in the ledger were not survivors. They were the ones no one looked for. During a town hall meeting in Dunbridge in 2004, an ageing nun named Sister Alice Marie attended quietly in the back row. She had served at St. Abigail's between 1951 and 1959, before transferring to a mission in Honduras. When asked by a local reporter whether she believed the ledger was authentic, she nodded once and said only, "They weren't lost, they were taken and quieted." No further statement was given. She died a year later. No obituary was published. When outsiders ask how this could have happened, how 107 children could disappear without sparking outrage, protest, or investigation, the answer is unnervingly simple. No one wanted to know. The children who arrived at St. Abigail's were already invisible. They were orphans, illegitimate, sick, deemed unfit or burdensome in adoption files. Some had developmental delays, others had scars from previous institutions. A few had simply been born into poverty. They were the kind of children who, on paper, already didn't exist. And so when they vanished, the world continued, unchecked, unbothered, unaware. Today the orchard still stands. The trees are overgrown, the grass is knee-high. A few twisted iron rails remain from a perimeter fence that once separated the chapel grounds from the burial field. In spring, wild lilies bloom along a crooked line that runs 20 feet east of the chapel wall. A line that, when traced against blueprints, matches the exact position of the trench described by William Herrick in 1961. But there are no markers, no headstones, no plaques, only a silence that seems to settle too heavily over that patch of ground. With the discovery of the ledger, the story of St. Abigail's entered a new phase. No longer confined to rumour or suppressed testimony, it now had form, proof, names, a record that the church could not easily deny. And yet even now the ledger remains sealed from public access. The original copy is presumed to reside in the Diocesan Archive of Restricted Materials, where it is unlikely to be seen again. Its only surviving evidence remains in 2 film rolls, developed in a volunteer archive room by a woman who died before she could publish her findings. But in those images, the names remain, frozen, inked, remembered, against the will of those who buried them. In early May of 1971, St. Abigail's Home for Children underwent what was officially termed a structural reassessment and property evaluation. The interior of the chapel had begun to show signs of foundational slippage, and part of the rectory roof had collapsed during a spring thaw. The Diocese of Hartford issued a temporary closure order. All children still housed on the premises were to be relocated within 2 weeks. The official number was 63. Of those, only one group would later draw attention, a cluster of 11 girls, ages estimated between 8 and 13, who were transferred together to a temporary Catholic-run shelter in North Canton. The social worker assigned to their transition was Judith Rowe, a newly certified state employee with a background in child psychiatric support. She had no prior history with church-run facilities and no knowledge of St. Abigail's reputation. What she encountered in the van that afternoon would remain with her for the rest of her life. The transport vehicle was standard, a 16-passenger shuttle, vinyl seats, state tags. Judith sat near the front, clipboard in hand, ready to verify head counts, health reports, and reassignment files. But as she glanced over the group, she immediately noted the silence. Not shyness, not fatigue, stillness. The girls did not speak, did not fidget. They sat upright, hands folded in laps, or placed gently on knees, eyes forward, not blank but impossibly restrained. When she offered a bottle of water, not one reached out. Only when the driver turned down the gravel road did she hear sound at all, soft, rhythmic tapping from the back row. One girl had begun to knock her knuckles lightly against the window, not in distress, but as if counting. Judith asked her name. There was no reply. She tried again. Nothing. all 11 remained completely mute the entire 47-minute drive. Upon arrival, intake workers began filing routine assessments: height, weight, dental notes, allergy markers. But the girls offered nothing. They did not speak, respond to questions, or follow verbal instruction unless physically guided. Judith marked the term dissociative mutism on her notes. 2 were observed flinching at the sight of nuns stationed at the receiving office. 1 girl refused to enter the hallway entirely until the sister on duty removed her habit. By the end of the first day, staff resorted to a colour-coded cue card system to communicate: red for no, green for yes, yellow for unsure. Most of the girls chose not to engage at all. Judith later wrote in a confidential report, "I do not believe this silence is caused by trauma alone. It appears programmed, rehearsed, maintained as ritual." One phrase began to recur in Judith's private notes, written not in the official logbook, but scrawled hastily in the margin of her day planner: "They only speak in the orchard." She never heard the phrase aloud. It was found etched into the back of a paperback copy of the Gospel According to Mark, a book one of the girls carried. The phrase was written over and over again on the inside back cover, dozens of times, pressed so deeply with pencil that it tore through the paper. When Judith asked who had written it, the girl closed the book, turned it upside down, and placed it back beneath her pillow. The room remained silent. 3 days later, a behavioural therapist was brought in from the state hospital to perform assessments. The evaluations yielded little. Of the 11, only 1 made eye contact, briefly, when handed a drawing pad. She sketched a tree, large, leafless. Underneath it, 11 small figures standing in a circle. The therapist asked if the picture represented them. The girl looked away. When asked again, she whispered 4 words, barely audible. "We weren't supposed to be." She did not speak again. The girls were kept together in a shared dormitory under low stimulation observation. Lights dimmed, mealtimes quiet. No religious iconography allowed in their rooms. Yet, despite the precautions, their behaviour became increasingly synchronised. They woke at the same time, without alarm. They refused to eat if one refused, and each night they arranged their beds in the same formation: 2 on each wall, 3 along the back, and 1 cot left untouched in the corner. When asked why that bed was left empty, Judith received only silence. When a volunteer mistakenly assigned a new arrival to it, the girls stood in the centre of the room and did not move until the child was removed. What makes this case particularly disturbing is how quickly the records surrounding it disappeared. Official state files for the group exist only in fragments: intake forms, unfiled assessments, a single medical invoice, no follow-up reports, no case closures. Judith Rowe submitted her final psychological summary on June 2, 1971. It read, "Subjects not recommended for reintegration. Risk of re-traumatization high. No verbal restoration. Observed behaviors suggest chronic conditioning and fear of punishment linked to vocalization. Recommend long-term psychiatric shelter with no religious affiliation." The report was marked "Received," then archived, never followed up. Judith left the department the following year. She cited administrative negligence and systemic denial of critical care as reasons for her resignation. In interviews decades later, she claimed she had submitted 3 formal requests to locate the 11 girls, once in 1973, again in 1981, and finally in 1990. All were returned marked "No record found." When she asked how that could be possible, how 11 wards of the state could vanish from foster placement without a trace, she was told it was likely a clerical error, that the girls had probably been adopted in a group placement. Judith never believed that, not once. In 2009, a FOIA request filed by an investigative journalist for the Hartford Herald uncovered a receipt ledger from St. Michael's Mental Health Home in Bridgeport. The document listed a food delivery to a silent ward room C. The quantity was for 11 trays, dated July 1971. The facility had closed in 1978, No patient names from that wing were ever released, and when the journalist requested follow-up access to the original intake books, the pages from May through August had been torn out. It is believed, though never confirmed, that the 11 girls were relocated again. Where and under what authority remains unknown. Today, not one of them can be found in any Connecticut state census, federal tax return, school registry, or Social Security archive. They vanished, not through death, but through erasure. What makes this chapter of the St. Abigail story uniquely chilling is its psychological dimension. The silence of the girls is more than a symptom of abuse. It was a design. These children did not run. They did not scream. They did not fight. They obeyed a silence so complete that it followed them even into state care. It wasn't compliance. It was survival. Because whatever they saw, whatever they lived through, was not just traumatic. It was forbidden. The phrase that appeared in the back of the gospel, "They only speak in the orchard," has become a whispered phrase among those familiar with the case. Some believe it referred to a punishment site, others to a place of ritual confession. Judith once hypothesized that the orchard was where the girls were taken to witness something, and that only those who stayed silent were spared. She believed the 11 were not the chosen ones. She believed they were the ones who remained, the ones who watched the others go. Today, the North Canton shelter, where they stayed, is a private residence. The room where they slept has been renovated. No one who lives there now knows what it once was. Judith Rowe passed away in 2016. Among her possessions was a folder marked "Abigail Remaining." Inside, 11 Polaroids. Blurry, undated. Each shows a girl standing beside the others. Each one not looking at the camera. Each one not speaking. In March of 2007, a team of independent investigators working on a limited oral history project for post-war religious institutions traced a lead to a Carmelite retirement home outside Albany, New York. The tip had come from a former archivist, now terminally ill, who believed one of the last living members of St. Abigail's staff was still alive, living under a new name. The name she'd chosen was Sister Agnella, but her birth name and the name signed in the margins of multiple confiscated ledgers was Sister Marianne Eltridge. She was 93 years old, and for the first time since 1963, she agreed to speak. The interview took place over 2 days. It was conducted in a private chapel, dimly lit, with windows sealed against winter winds. The recorder was left running without interruption. Sister Marianne's voice was slow, deliberate. At times, her sentences trailed into silence, not because she had forgotten, but because she feared what remembering might mean. She sat with a rosary in her left hand, her thumb turning over the beads as she spoke. She agreed to anonymity at first, but by the second day, she insisted her name be used. "I have kept it hidden for too long," she said, "and so have they." What she described in that chapel was not a scandal. It was a system. Not one built on chaos or madness, but order, doctrine, and a conviction that suffering had meaning if properly directed. Her term for it was the rule of separation. According to Sister Marianne, this was an unwritten but fully enforced internal guideline at St. Abigail's. It stated that certain children, those who could not or would not be adopted, were not to be exposed to society, that they were marked either by birth, by sin, or by failure of obedience. These children were not punished. They were released. She never used the word death, not once. She called it returning them to God, those who had been abused in prior institutions, those born to unwed mothers, those with visible birth defects, those who showed rebellion against church authority. If they did not conform, they were separated. First through isolation in the chapel's side dormitory, then through fasting, then silence. Finally, a ritual of washing conducted in the infirmary, often referred to euphemistically as the procession. At that point, they were no longer assigned lessons. Their files were closed, and they were moved to the orchard. Sister Marianne's role in this process was clerical but intimate. She maintained the chapel. She prepared vestments. She recorded the names. She remembered each child by their first name. She recited them aloud, eyes closed, as though repeating a litany she had carried for decades. Therese, Martin, Clara, Elias, Joan, Ruth, Gabriel. Some, she said, had been there for years. Others arrived and were marked within weeks. We didn't kill them, not with hands. That's not what this was. But we believed something just as wrong. We believed we were helping them leave. When asked how such a belief could take hold, she paused. Then she said, it was not belief, it was instruction. She claimed that the rule of separation was handed down through internal memos, never written as law, but always understood. The justification was theological, that these children, unfit for earthly guardianship, were to be protected from further corruption by being delivered directly to God's mercy. They were called the untethered, and once a child was designated untethered, no attempts were made to rehabilitate, reassign, or rehome. They became subject to the ritual of quiet withdrawal, and, ultimately, burial. Sister Marianne admitted she had questioned the rule only once. In 1959, after a child named Francis had asked, "What comes after the orchard?" Francis was 10, partially blind. She had once hidden food under her mattress to feed another girl, too sick to attend meals. That was deemed disobedience. She was placed under observation, then removed. That night, Sister Marianne found her bed stripped, her clothes burned in the boiler room, her file was gone. When she asked Sister Maureen why, the answer was simple: she has returned. Over the course of the interview, Sister Marianne never raised her voice. Her words carried no melodrama, only weight. Each sentence landed like stone. She confessed she kept the ledger out of guilt, not as protest but as memory, that no one else would remember the names, and that if she didn't write them, they would vanish entirely. The red markings beside each name were not orders. They were farewells. Each mark, she said, was a prayer she had no permission to say aloud. The church's response to the interview was immediate and defensive. When the transcript was leaked in redacted form to a regional news outlet, the Archdiocese issued a formal statement calling the allegations deeply troubling, but ultimately unfounded and unverifiable due to the passage of time and the failing memory of the witness. They offered no denial of the institutional history, only the fallibility of an old woman's recollections. But those who had studied the St. Abigail's case knew better, because every detail she spoke matched what had already been uncovered. The processions, the trench alignments, the silence. What makes this testimony unforgettable is not the horror it describes, it's the conviction. Sister Marianne was not describing chaos, she was describing liturgy. She was not crying for justice. She was bearing witness to something she had helped build, and had spent half a century unable to dismantle. The final 15 minutes of her interview were uninterrupted. She looked toward the chapel's crucifix and spoke the last words with trembling voice. "I do not ask for forgiveness, not from men. I do not believe I can be forgiven, but I believe they must be remembered, not as ghosts, as children. They didn't die for doctrine. They were lost to it. We wrote their names in silence, and then we buried the silence too." She died 5 months later. Her funeral was small. The church did not mention her testimony in the eulogy, but her words remain, and with them the most damning revelation of all. St. Abigail's was not a rogue facility. It was not the product of individual cruelty. It operated for decades with funding, oversight, and permission. The horror was not in what was done secretly. It was in what was done with approval. The next scene would confirm everything Sister Marianne said, not through words, but through bones, buried not in metaphor, but in rows behind the orchard, exactly where she said they would be. In the fall of 2012, a coalition of independent investigators, archivists, and former municipal surveyors gathered at the outer edge of a long-abandoned property on the outskirts of Dunbridge, Connecticut. The chapel was boarded shut. The dormitories had collapsed inward years earlier. Vines and saplings now broke through the window frames. What remained was overgrown ground, rusted fencing, and a scatter of stone footings buried beneath moss. But the orchard, quiet, weathered, and unnaturally flat, still stood. No official town document ever recorded its boundary. No land deed ever described its existence. It did not appear on any of the site maps held by the diocese. It was not named in church registers, zoning records, or county development plans. It was, in every formal sense, invisible. And yet it was there, 5 trees wide and 18 trees long, bounded at one end by the eastern wall of the old chapel, and at the other by a dry well no longer used, covered with rotted boards and caved earth. It was known only in whispers, and in a ledger buried under the altar. The group was led by Catherine Hallberg, a forensic anthropologist turned independent human rights investigator. She had worked in post-conflict zones, identifying remains in mass graves left by political purges and civil collapse. She had never expected to do the same work on domestic soil. The equipment they brought included 2 portable, ground-penetrating radar units, calibrated for sub-meter readings. The technology was not experimental. It had been used for decades in environmental archaeology and unmarked burial sites. What they were looking for were disruptions in the earth, areas where natural soil layers had been displaced, refilled, compacted unnaturally. They began in the northwest quadrant. Within an hour, they found the first pit. It measured 17 feet long by 3 feet wide. A consistent depth signature suggested it had been dug mechanically, perhaps with spades or shovels, not industrial tools. 3 feet east of that, another pit, slightly shorter, and then a third. All 3 were aligned at an angle, one that perfectly mirrored the shadow line cast by the eastern wall of the chapel during late morning, around the hour of Vespers. That detail matched precisely what Sister Marianne Eltridge had described 5 years earlier. They buried them where the light did not touch. The ledger she left behind, which had been confiscated, spoke of the orchard rose and the 4th tree by the stone. Her memory had been dismissed as the fading guilt of an elderly woman. But the soil said otherwise. The total scan revealed 7 trench-style burials, some long, some staggered, 2 overlapped, 1 curved. When the local preservation society was notified, they requested a single test excavation, just one, under supervised forensic conditions. Permission was granted by the town. The diocese did not respond. The dig began 3 weeks later, with 2 archaeological technicians, a state-certified pathologist, and 1 legal observer present. At 12 inches, the tools were exchanged for hand trowels. At 23 inches, a fragment was uncovered. Small, porous, yellowed, a rib, child-sized. 6 inches below that, a humerus, fused at the shoulder, attached to a partial sternum, and then another, and another. Within 3 square feet there were bones from at least 5 individuals. No shoes, no clothing fibres, no burial wrappings, just earth, bone, and silence. The site was shut down immediately. The trench perimeter was flagged. A temporary privacy barrier was erected. The team filed a mandatory report with the Connecticut office of the Chief Medical Examiner, but 3 days later, the office returned a formal statement. Due to the historical nature of the findings, jurisdiction falls outside active forensic investigation. No crime is currently under inquiry. The diocese issued no comment, no press conference was held, no representative from the church arrived at the site. The analysis of the remains was completed off-site. The bones were consistent with juvenile skeletal structures ranging from 4 to 11 years of age. Most showed signs of advanced malnutrition, delayed ossification, narrow femurs, porous cranial plates. At least 3 skulls bore evidence of impact trauma, fractures at the base, compression at the crown, injury consistent not with blunt force from violence, but from sustained contact with hard surfaces over time, wooden bedposts, concrete floors, or repeated falls. No dental records were available. because no records existed at all. These were children the state never counted, children the church never claimed, children whose last names had never been written down. What makes this discovery devastating is not simply the presence of the bones. It's what surrounded them. Nothing. No caskets, no burial rites, no prayer cards, only soil turned back on top of them, and rows of trees planted over the silence. This was not neglect, this was design. It wasn't that someone forgot to register their deaths. It was that someone decided their lives did not require acknowledgement. It was systematized erasure, murder by omission, by bureaucracy, by faith twisted into a kind of surgical detachment. They weren't mourned, they were filed away in earth. The orchard was never on any map because it was never supposed to be seen. Local authorities stepped back. The sheriff's office declared the site historically insulated. The town council issued a statement about the importance of healing and not inflaming the past. Catherine Hallberg requested a second dig. It was denied. No permits were issued. The trenches remained sealed, but the team had photographs, x-rays, documentation, evidence that could not be buried again. The photographs were released online in a limited report. Most of the public never saw them, but those who did remember the bones curled into themselves. The way the skulls had cracked, the fragments too small to catalogue. One image, flagged by nearly every content system that attempted to host it, showed a ribcage and jaw nestled together, positioned as if the child had died with their head resting on their own chest, as though bracing for something they could not name. The orchard trees, now over 70 years old, still bloom each spring. Their roots thread through the unmarked graves. Insects cluster in hollows. Birds nest in silence. Locals report strange soil shifts, areas where the ground softens inexplicably, where the earth breathes in rain but refuses to firm again. No one walks there, not anymore. A fence was erected in 2015. There is no plaque, no cross, no marker of what the ground conceals. Only a rusted sign that reads, "Private property, no trespassing." What makes this the emotional and factual climax of the St. Abigail story is that it removes all ambiguity. This was not about faded memories or disputed testimony. This was not about what might have happened. The children were here, the trenches were dug, the bones exist, and the silence was engineered. The church declined to exhume. They declined to test DNA. They declined to name the dead. Their official statement declared the orchard a tragic but unverified element of local law and warned against misrepresenting the sacred history of institutions that once cared for society's most vulnerable. But no institution that cared would leave children nameless beneath the soil. No act of mercy requires silence that deep. In every known culture, the burial of a child is a moment of sacred pause, a disruption of order so profound that ceremony must rise to meet it. But at St. Abigail's, there was no ceremony. Only trenches, only trees, only names written in pencil and buried under wax. This wasn't mercy, it was management. This wasn't madness, it was obedience. And perhaps the most haunting realization of all, no one ever came looking. No parent arrived with a photo, no protest stood at the gate, because the system was built to ensure that the ones buried here were the ones least likely to be missed. The invisible, the inconvenient, the orphaned not just by death but by design. The orchard wasn't forgotten, it was hidden. And like all things hidden too long, when the truth finally emerged, it came not as revelation, but as evidence, unarguable, unearthed, and ignored. The next chapter of this story will not be told by historians, or priests, or archivists. It will be written by the soil itself. And in that writing, every red mark in Sister Eltridge's ledger becomes a grave. Every silent name becomes an indictment, and every root twisted through bone becomes the proof the world refused to see. Today, the ruins of St. Abigail's Home for Children sit behind a locked rusted gate on the eastern edge of Dunbridge, Connecticut. The chapel collapsed in on itself after a fire in 2009. The steeple, what remained of it, tilted for years before finally toppling during a thunderstorm in 2017. The grounds are inaccessible, not by law, but by design. Weeds rise higher than a man's chest. Rusted nails protrude from splintered timbers. The orchard, still intact, stands behind a stretch of collapsed fencing no one has repaired. There is no historical marker, no visitor's plaque, no stone etched with names, just earth, wind, and a silence that has hardened over time. The fire that gutted the main building was officially ruled accidental. Local fire crews found no trace of accelerant, but the origin point, an old record room, raised questions. It had housed nearly 400 boxes of paper materials, baptism records, correspondence logs, death certificates, invoices, disciplinary sheets. Almost none of it survived. When asked about digital backups, the diocese stated that the collection had not yet been digitized due to backlog and resource prioritization. In the end, only fragments of scorched ledgers were recovered, none of them complete, none of them containing full names. What little documentation remained had already been extracted by private researchers, quietly and without official permission, in the years prior. Those copies now reside in sealed archives. Some are lost, others were purchased. The last confirmed location of Sister Marianne Eltridge's original ledger was a climate-controlled library in Montclair, New Jersey. Privately owned, its inventory closed to the public. The ledger had been offered at an auction under the vague title Ecclesiastical Register, 1940s-1960s New England. It sold for $11,000. Attempts to retrieve it through legal petition failed. Ownership was deemed private, protected. The ledger, the only surviving first-hand record of 107 unacknowledged children, is now classified as a historical curiosity. Its contents may never be seen again. The footage, known only as procession, still exists, in part. Most publicly accessible versions have been taken down for violating platform policies. The original digitized file, made by Daniel Quist in 2003, is corrupted in places. Frame skips, loss of synchronization, contrast issues. It floats from mirror to mirror on obscure data-sharing networks, but those who watch it never forget what they see. Children in white gowns walking silently through an orchard, a trench, a figure in a habit sprinkling holy water, then static, nothing more and nothing less. Theologians who reviewed the full record, those who chose to speak, and many did not, were cautious in their wording. But one, Dr. Adrian Fell, Professor Emeritus at a Jesuit seminary in Maryland, gave a private statement on condition of anonymity. He said, "There is no theological defense for what occurred. If the acts were committed as described, and they seem to have been, then the people responsible committed mortal sin. They concealed death. They buried the innocent without right. They denied their humanity. This is not a failure of individual morality. It is the failure of a system that believed it could define salvation administratively." When asked whether absolution was possible, he said, "For those who died, they are beyond the reach of sin now. But for the rest, for those who knew and looked away, that debt cannot be measured, only remembered." But remembrance requires acknowledgement, and that is where this story ends. Not with punishment, but with refusal. There were no indictments, no class action suits, no papal apology, no tribunal. The Church issued carefully phrased condolences for unverified suffering and moved on. The state declined to intervene, citing expired statutes and lack of jurisdiction. The parishioners of Dunbridge were told to pray for healing. But they were never told the names, because officially there are none. What makes this story unforgivable isn't what was done. It's how many people knew. Not just at the end, when whispers reached journalists and independent researchers, but from the beginning. Staff who kept records, funeral homes that buried sealed boxes without questions, medical boards that received incomplete death reports and filed them without follow-up, construction workers who were paid cash to dig trenches, Local police who stepped away because it was church business. There was no conspiracy, just 100 moments of silence, stacked one on top of the other, until the weight of it buried the truth. One retired social worker, when shown photos of the orchard graves, said, "I remember that girl, one of the silent ones. We placed her with 3 others. They all flinched at hymns, wouldn't sleep facing crucifixes. One night she whispered, 'They don't like when you cry during prayers.' I wrote that down, but no one read my report." Her report was archived, then destroyed. In the years since the final excavation was denied, the town of Dunbridge has quietly tried to rebrand itself. Tourism boards promote antique shops and restored inns. The chapel ruins are absent from brochures. When asked about the site, most residents shrug. They say, "It's been closed for years," or "It was a school, I think." A few say nothing, and one, an elderly man who once served on the town council, said simply, "We did what we were told, and after a while, we stopped asking who told us." At the easternmost edge of the property, near the crumbled garden wall, a cluster of lilies still bloom. No one planted them. They return each spring, white and silent. Some say a woman unseen leaves flowers there once a year. A single rose, always white, no note, no signature, but always on the same day, June 14th, the same date as the letter Sister Marianne wrote in 1963, the letter that begged for the place to be shut down, the one no one read. Today, those who remember St. Abigail's remember it in fragments. A hymn hummed too quietly, a name scrawled in a book that no longer exists, a trench that still curves beneath the earth, beneath the roots, beneath the orchard no one will map. The children were never counted, never prayed for, never buried with a cross or eulogy. No mass was ever said for them, and perhaps that is the final cruelty. Not the silence of death, but the refusal of remembrance, because in every culture, the act of prayer for the dead is a sacred rite, a recognition that their life mattered. To deny them even that is to say they were never human, that they never needed to be remembered. And yet they were, by one nun with trembling hands and a pencil, by one social worker with a broken report, by one historian with a salvaged reel, and now by us. This is not closure. There is no comfort to be found in these ruins, only a wound left open, a place where names were buried not in soil, but in silence, a place where children were processed like inventory, a place where faith was used not to heal, but to forget. St. Abigail's does not need to be haunted, because what happened there was not a ghost story, it was a system. And systems do not scream, they record, they authorize, they file, and they forget. So if you find yourself walking the edge of an overgrown orchard in Connecticut, and you feel the wind fall silent between the trees, remember this: they are not beneath your feet. They are in the ledger that was never published, in the reports that were never processed, in the prayers that were never spoken, and most of all, in the space between names we were never allowed to say aloud.